Hey, have you ever wondered how cheese came about to begin with? Like, way back in the late Stone Age, after people had domesticated sheep and goats just enough to try milking them? What were those early cheeses like? Turns out you can head over to your local supermarket and find out, because some cheeses have been made basically the same way for the last several thousand years. Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. It's finally feeling like spring in most parts of the Northern Hemisphere, and this is the best time of year to explore cheeses pretty much fresh from the animal. The pastures are full of fresh young grass and wildflowers, and animals who are able to graze on such delicacies tend to give sweet, even slightly floral milk, and those flavors get concentrated when we make cheese. So far on the Curdverse, we've mostly been talking about aged cheeses, ones that are held for weeks or months before eating. Today, we're talking about cheeses that can be eaten the same day they're made, or perhaps a day or two later. Many of the same cheeses can be aged further, from a week or two to a couple of months, taking on increasingly different characters as they go. So in this episode, to get a very small sense of that shift, we'll use 2 weeks of age as our cutoff point in talking about these young cheeses. One other point of definition. So far in classifying cheeses, I've mainly been talking about rennet cheeses and heat acid cheeses. These refer to the two main methods of coagulating milk. And in the context of Western European-style cheeses, it's a pretty useful distinction. Most aged cheeses are made with rennet. Most fresh cheeses have little to none. But when we look more closely at the large category of young fresh cheeses, it turns out that those words most and little to none gloss over some pretty major differences in the cheese types. So for this episode, we're going to use a different categorization scheme. This one based not on the coagulation method, but on how the different cheese types have historically been made safe for consumption. Some rely on high heat to kill undesirable microbes, and others rely on acid. The reason I'm making that distinction based on different approaches to dairy safety is because these methods are very old, vastly older than the rennet-based slow-age forms of cheese that are common in Europe today. In fact, they go back to the very beginning of dairying, probably as far back as the late Neolithic period. Turns out, our deep ancestors were remarkably clever in developing safe forms of milk preservation. So bear in mind, any young cheese sold commercially in the US will be made with pasteurized milk, with new cultures added back to the milk after pasteurization. But I think it's important to understand why some of these cheeses are made one way and some another, both because it helps explain the regional distribution of different young cheese types, and also because the different techniques affect the flavor and texture of the different cheeses. Let's start with the most common, and in some ways the most natural form of protection, acidification. Back in episode 2, I said that for most cheeses there are two main phases of cheese making: acidification and dehydration. Acid can be introduced from some non-dairy forms, such as vinegar, lemon juice, or nowadays citric acid. But in most cases, the milk acidifies or ferments due to lactobacilli bacteria resident in the milk. These are the same bacteria used in other ferments, such as pickles, by the way. They eat the sugars in the food, lactose in the case of the milk, and in the process they convert it to lactic acid. Most other categories of bacteria don't cope terribly well with acid, so by acidifying the milk, we create a hostile environment for unwanted types of bacteria. So different types of cheese are acidified to different levels. In the case of what are called lactic cheeses, or lactic coagulated cheeses, the pH levels are quite low, below 4.7, which is to say they're very high acid cheeses. A lower pH means more acid. In fact, these lactic cheeses are slightly closer to the acid levels of vinegar than they are to fresh milk. That's where that signature tang of the lactic cheeses like Chèvre comes from, is that low pH level. Okay, so if you take a pail of fresh milk straight from the animal and just leave it to sit around for, say, 2 to 4 days in warm spring or summer temperatures, you get a delicately coagulated mass without doing anything at all. It's not hard to imagine that this is where humans started with cheesemaking. Now, that curd mass is not very strong. It will fall apart pretty easily if you put a spoon in it. And because it's been sitting around for a pretty long time unrefrigerated to get to that point, that means it's spent a relatively long time at higher pH levels, which is to say it's been less acid. And that means, in turn, that other less desirable bacteria could conceivably have had more time to feed and propagate as well. So this isn't where we stop when making lactic cheeses, it's where we start. So just as with sourdough, we'll feed that initial starter solution, which we call clabber, several more times until it's very active and acidifies rapidly. The key to making lactic cheeses from raw milk that are safe to eat is getting to a low pH, high acidity, in a relatively short period of time, typically somewhere in the range of 12 to 24 hours, maybe a little more. In effect, we arrange it so that the lactic acid bacteria are already a lap into the race, while the other bacteria are still putting their shoes on. So it's just harder for the bad guys to get a foothold, much less catch up in those conditions. And the way we do that is by adding some of that starter culture to the milk. So that could be that clabber, or it could be cultured buttermilk, or whey from a previous batch of cheese, or nowadays some kind of commercial starter culture. Now obviously you can do the same with pasteurized milk. You'll just need to add more starter culture of whichever kind in order to make up for the lack of active lactobacillic bacteria in the pasteurized milk. In order to make the final product slightly more solid and easier to spoon into a draining container, cheesemakers will typically add a drop or two of rennet along with the starter culture, but the primary coagulation is really driven by the acid itself, not the rennet. And that acid coagulation is what forms the particular texture of lactic cheeses. So instead of a solid block of curd, you get a bunch of little teeny tiny curds that kind of barely hang together. In very moist, high-fat lactic cheeses, that mouthfeel is kind of masked, and it simply reads to us as creamy because there isn't a solid curd. But in drier forms of lactic cheeses, that different structure becomes more apparent. So they can feel a little grainy or maybe kind of cakey in your mouth. There's an excellent article on how acid and rennet coagulation differ chemically on cheesescience.org. I'll include a link in the show notes if you want to dive deeper on that. One other useful effect of that rapid lactobacillus-driven acidification is that by the time you reach your target pH, virtually all the sugars, or lactose, in the milk have been consumed. That's why the curd has that sour tang. So these are great cheeses for people who like the creamy, milky flavors of fresh cheese, but are lactose intolerant. So once the lactic curd has acidified and solidified enough to drain, it can be turned into a number of different types of cheese. The most familiar to us here in North America is chèvre, which is made from goat milk. Chèvre just means goat in French. There are also a number of cheeses made using the same process, but with cow milk. They go by various names, such as fromage frais, fromage blanc, faisselle in French, Quark in German-speaking countries. Because cow milk is fairly bland, these are often eaten either for breakfast or else dessert with honey or fruit mixed in. Lactic cheeses of these types are intended to be eaten more or less right away. Start them one day, drain or eat them the next, or maybe over a couple of days. Because that creamy mouthfeel is desirable, they're not drained very much, and so they're relatively high in moisture, even spoonable. So even though they're high-acid cheeses, that additional moisture will cause more rapid spoilage through the appearance of unwanted, though not necessarily harmful, molds, especially blue molds, and they will continue to get increasingly sour. If they do start developing a dirtier gray kind of color, or pink or yellow molds, or a slimy texture, you do definitely want to throw them out. But you can continue to drain the fresh curd for longer, usually a day or two in a cheese form, and wind up with a dry enough curd that the cheese can then be aged in a number of different ways, for anywhere from a week or two to a couple of months. One of the common approaches in cooler, moister regions, such as the Atlantic coast of France, the Alpine foothills of Italy, Piedmont, Lombardy, the upper reaches of the Veneto, is to encourage the growth of a yeast called geotrichum on the surface of the cheese. Sometimes a white mold called Penicillium candidum joins the geotrichum as well. These are called bloomy rind cheeses because the yeast and mold spores bloom on the surface of the cheese. Examples of these lactic bloomies include Italian robiola, which can be 100% goat or made from a mix of milks, French brie de Menin, a cow cheese, and numerous bloomy goats. In Iberia, they make bloomy logs called cañas from either sheep or goat milk. I talk about all of these in more detail in episode 7. In southern France, which is warmer and drier than the Atlantic coast, smaller lactic goat cheeses might acquire just a light sprinkling of geotrichum, but more often they're served naked at about a week old. If they're left to dry out further, they become hard, grateable cheeses after a month or so. These small goat cheeses may also be wrapped in alcohol-soaked leaves of various plants. I've got a link to a blog on these types of cheeses in the show notes. And sometimes they can be marinated in oils with various herbs. The oil is most often olive oil, although one can also use nut oils for various different flavors. And that oil seals the cheese off from oxygen. And in that anaerobic environment, they can last for months, while still maintaining the soft texture of a fresh cheese. Now remember, in this whole discussion, there has never been any form of heat being applied to the milk in the course of cheese making at all, unless, of course, the milk has been refrigerated, in which case you bring it up to room temperature before beginning the cheese making process. So this minimal intervention approach is an ideal one for showcasing the fresh flavors of spring pasture, which is why raw milk versions are especially greeted with such delight in the spring in places like France, where some of them are allowed. The heat of the pasteurization process will tend to destroy some of these very delicate flavors, so the seasonality of these cheeses will be less apparent if purchased in North America, but you may still be able to detect an unusual sweetness in amongst the tart lactic flavors. In the absence of heat, the acid produced by the lactobacillic microbes limits the growth of other microbial types, and many of them will die off. But the primary game here is to crowd out the harmful microbes, keeping them at low enough levels that a healthy human can easily fend off any potential milk-borne illness. And there's a reason these types of cheeses are often found in cooler climates, such as the mountains and oceanic regions of Europe. In hotter places, there's just a lot more opportunity for all types of microbes to reproduce quickly. And so in most of the rest of the world, humans have used high heat, sometimes in combination with acid, to make fresh cheeses safe to consume. Let's talk a minute about pasteurization. In the West, we're told it was a process discovered in the late 1800s by a Frenchman, Louis Pasteur. In reality, humans across Afro-Eurasia have been using the principles of what we call pasteurization for thousands of years. So what is pasteurization? Briefly, it's heat treating the milk to kill off enough of the resident microbes, good guys and bad guys alike, to reduce the total microbial count in the milk to a level deemed safe for normal, healthy humans. Again, just as with the acidification method, this isn't totally binary even if we usually talk about it that way. In most pasteurization processes, the microbes aren't actually all dead down to the very last man or microbe, but they're few enough in number that a healthy human immune system can deal with any potential troublemakers. Pasteurization can happen at a range of temperatures from 145F or 63C to 280F or 137C. At that higher temperature, it's considered ultra-pasteurized. As with cooked pork or chicken, the point at which milk is considered pasteurized by modern certifying authorities is a function not just of temperature, but also of time. And this is really important to remember when we're talking about cheeses that are pasteurized as part of the final steps of their manufacture. So if cheese makers plan to use pasteurized milk, they prefer a process called vat pasteurization, in which the milk is heated and kept at 145F or 63C for 30 minutes, and then chilled to the desired temperature for starting the cheese. This relatively low temperature is much gentler for the milk and has less effect on the proteins than higher temperature processes. Two other key figures to remember are 161F, 72C, for 15 seconds, and 191F, or 88C, for a mere 1 second. So again, 161 for 15 seconds, 191, 1 second. Now here's the key. There are several types of fresh cheeses in which either the milk itself or the pressed cheese curd spends at least a couple minutes, sometimes up to 20 minutes, at 185F or 85C, which is to say that they reach the pasteurization point, and then some, in the process of making cheese, even if they're starting with raw milk. There's a reason the magical number is 185F. It's at that point that milk proteins, and also egg proteins, as you may have observed in cooking eggs or custards, The milk proteins begin to snap and coagulate into discrete little blobs. That's why you get scrambled eggs at a certain point. Cheeses that merely pass through hot 185-degree whey as the last step of their process are typically rennet cheeses. So the rennet maintains the overall integrity of the curd mass, although the heat does relax the proteins a bit and it makes the curd more malleable until it's chilled again. Once it's chilled, that sets the proteins in their new shape. So that's the process used for stretch curd cheeses like mozzarella, as well as some grillable cheeses like halloumi. The heat also kills most of the lactic acid bacteria, and that slows souring because they're no longer converting the lactose to lactic acid. On the other hand, because there are so few good guy bacteria left, they're also not there to fight off unwanted microbial or mold growth, so it's still important to eat most of these cheeses fairly quickly. On the other hand, there are a number of cheeses called heat acid cheeses, in which the milk itself is heated up to close to 185, and acid and sometimes salt are added, and then the milk continues to heat to 185 or so until the molecular bonds in the milk start to snap, and the solids start coming out of solution in little clumps. In the West, we know the result is ricotta, or sometimes pot cheese. Further east, everywhere from India to Mongolia, the ricotta curds are drained and then aggressively pressed into a rubbery slab, at which point it gets cut into chunks or slices, and then it gets called paneer, bislak, or any number of other terms. In Latin America, it's known as queso blanco. With these cheeses, there is no developed acid at all, which is to say that the milk is not fermented. The acid is simply added to help complete the rupture of the molecular bonds. So these cheeses are relatively high in lactose. And they're also lacking in active bacteria, good or bad. So again, these are cheeses that can only last 2 or 3 days at room temperature, at most 2 weeks under refrigeration. But when eaten fresh, it makes very little difference if you started the process with pasteurized milk, because your milk spends 10 to 20 minutes at 185 F at the end of it. And then there are yogurt cheeses. They use both lactic acid and heat to preserve the milk safely, kind of a belt and suspenders approach. Not surprisingly, these tend to be common in really warm regions such as the middle latitudes and desert regions of Asia, as well as Arabia and East Africa. To make yogurt, you once again heat up fresh milk to that magical 185 F, which begins to break down the protein structures in the milk, ultimately making for a creamier final product. It also pasteurizes the milk. But then you let the milk cool back down to around 110 F or 43 C, and then you add either a few spoons of yogurt from an earlier batch or whey drained from that yogurt. Both the yogurt and its whey will contain those active lactobacillic cultures. And in the ensuing hours, during which you let the milk and starter incubate together at 110 F, they acidify the milk and rapidly drop the pH. These aren't typically quite as sour as the lactic cheeses we talked about before. Those go below 4.7, but 4.8 to 5 is a common range for yogurt. So now you have a low lactose, fairly acidic, yet bioactive product, from which several choices can be made depending on the type of cheese desired. Sometimes the yogurt is simply salted and drained. The salt slows the bacterial action, helping maintain the desired level of acidity rather than allowing it to continue to intensify. It also helps the curd shed whey. Exactly how much whey is drained varies by region and also from one maker to the next. But these drained yogurt cheeses dot the map of Eurasia from Icelandic skyr to West Asian labna and Central Asian susma to chaka in India. In some places, the strained yogurt is then pressed further between two slabs, makes cheese similar to paneer. In others, especially in very dry regions, the yogurt itself is reheated to steaming to help further cook off the liquid whey and thicken the yogurt, after which it's drained again, and then often rolled into balls and air-dried until the ball is rock hard. These are particular favorites of nomadic pastoralists, as they can be kept more or less indefinitely in any kind of weather so long as they stay dry, and they're really easy to transport. These hard yogurt balls can be found all across northern Asia, from the Caucasus to Siberia, as well as the mountain regions of Turkey, and among Bedouins in Arabia and North Africa. They're used as kind of an instant aged yogurt or sour cream by grating them into steaming hot water and then whisking the slurry until it thickens. There are some fresh cheeses that use neither acid nor heat extensively, and interestingly, they all come from very warm countries. Traditionally, they would be made with very fresh milk straight from the animal, sometimes heated just slightly in the range of 102 to 110 F, and then coagulated with rennet without the addition of any starter to pre-acidify the milk. A very traditional practice would be to salt the milk immediately prior to heating it to help slow microbial growth while the milk coagulates. This is done in parts of Egypt today and in some other regions as well. Sometimes, especially in Italy, the cheese is kept quite moist so that the freshly drained cheese has the texture of aspic or jello. Primo Sale is a prime example of this approach, although aged versions of the cheese are also sold, and that's usually what we get in the US. Caciotta is made in similar fashion, but allowed to develop a little bit of acid in a warm environment, like say around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 40 degrees prior to being brined. In other regions, such as Iberia, the drained curds are kneaded lightly to squeeze out some of their whey before they're molded and then briefly passed through a warm, not hot, whey, and then pressed. The time in the whey is just enough to help seal the rind, not enough to pasteurize. Latin American queso blanco takes the kneading approach as well, although a bit more vigorously, and then you salt the kneaded curds to stop acid development prior to putting them warm into molds, and then you just press them very lightly. The idea with most of these cheeses is that they'll be eaten within a day or two of being made. They rely entirely on the freshness and cleanliness of the milk, and at their best, they showcase the flavors of the milk itself better than any other cheese type. That said, because they don't have the layers of protection like acid or high heat, they can be higher risk if made from raw milk. Aside from the possibility of environmental contamination, there are animal illnesses such as brucellosis and Q fever that can be transmitted via the milk. Sometimes they can be severe enough to put people in the hospital. Brucellosis is mostly well contained in rich countries such as the US and the EU, but wild ruminants such as wild sheep and goats, deer, and bison are also carriers. Sometimes their stomping grounds overlap with the pastures used by meat and dairy animals. There are occasionally outbreaks in domesticated herds, and they're not always immediately caught. Brucellosis in domesticated animals remains an issue in many parts of the global south due to less access to testing and animal medications. So it's something to be aware of in consideration with your own risk profile if you choose to try these particular types of fresh raw milk cheeses while traveling. Pasteurization can kill these animal-borne pathogens just as it does environmental ones, so versions made with gently pasteurized milk can be a great way to enjoy them anytime. Next time on the Curdverse, we'll continue exploring the dairy events of spring with a special interview with Caroline Hostetler of Adopt an Alp. We'll talk transhumance, Swiss cheeses, and yes, very briefly, that whole 70s fondue thing. So join me again next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.